r/NoSleep. Posted by you/Lady of Hell. I live in a house next to a graveyard. The statue tried to kill me. Part 2. After that terrible day of the gutless escape, I was granted almost a full week of peace. Karth dropped by to get the metal pole back on the next day, but that was about it. The Inhumans kept their distance and I could actually focus on the farm work and taking care of my sick husband for once. That peace, however, ended on a particularly hot day, when the summer sun burnt mercilessly from a cloudless sky. I had told my employees to take it slow today and take lots of breaks, since I didn't want them to collapse from the heat, and so the 4 teenagers were sitting in the shadow of one of the larger trees when I brought a tray with homemade lemonade to them. Alice, one of the boys, called out as soon as he saw me. It had taken quite a while to convince them that they didn't need to call me Mrs. Shepherd. I was perfectly fine with being on a first-name basis with them, considering that I was only 24. "Something the matter?" I asked, placing the tray on the ground in front of them. The boy nodded and gestured to somewhere left of me, and when I turned my head, I saw one of my Inhumans standing by the tree line, staring directly at me. I sighed. The communication skills of these entities were questionable. "Don't worry," I told the boy. "I'll take care of it." I didn't think these monsters were that ugly, I heard one of the girls whisper as I walked away. "I heard the one in the graveyard is worse. Looks like straight out of a Cronenberg movie apparently," the other girl replied. I didn't say anything about that, just kept walking towards the Inhuman that was waiting for me. To be honest, I agreed with the second girl's take on the grave lady, and had the first girl been talking about the gutless, for example, I would have agreed with that too, but the one that was showing its face right now wasn't ugly. Or at least I didn't consider her to be. Her name was Angel, and I thought it was fitting, considering that an angel's appearance was supposed to be frightening. She was smaller than me and rather frail, but her presence was almost as imposing as the grave lady's. Angel possessed one wing, the left one, which was made of only twig-like bones and torn, translucent skin. Half of her head was overgrown with tumor-like growths, leaving only one eye for her to use. Her right hand reminded more of a claw than anything else, and the skin of her lower legs and feet looked blackened, almost necrotic. Although she didn't reveal it right now, I knew that her teeth were like canines, sharp enough to rip flesh from bones. Angel looked nothing but dangerous, yet she was probably the Inhuman I was the most comfortable with. "Hey," I greeted her with a smile. "You can come over, you know? No reason to stand here so ominously." She turned her head towards the teenagers, who had apparently already forgotten about the Inhuman and chatted happily while sharing lemonade. "You told us not to approach them. I didn't want to anger you. We had struck sort of a deal. The Inhumans kept their distance to my employees, but only as long as said employees stayed out of the woods. That was the only reasonable solution, considering that the gutless and the bloated, who I will tell you about another time, tended to stay in the woods, and these two weren't sane enough to argue with. The grave lady, Angel, and Karth had agreed to the deal without complaints, and so far, it had worked well enough, also because the teenagers were smart enough to follow the simple rule: stay out of the woods if you want to stay alive. "Maybe I should introduce you to them," I offered casually, hands buried in the pockets of my pants. "Show them that you're harmless." I grinned at her. "I'm not harmless, Alice," she replied without looking at me. That wasn't a topic I wanted to argue about today. Angel tended to refer to herself as a monster, and I tended to disagree, although to be honest, I was sure she could be dangerous if she wanted to. She just didn't seem aggressive. Contrary to the gutless or even the grave lady, I had never seen Angel hurt anyone. "So, can I help you with something?" I asked instead, changing the subject. "Is anyone giving you trouble?" My Inhumans didn't have the best relationships with each other, as far as I was aware. They usually didn't fight and simply kept their distance to each other, but none seemed to be on good terms. The house next to the graveyard and the village. They were peaceful places, but it was a fragile peace, and I was always afraid that it would break sooner or later. "There is something I need to show you," she declared, solemn as ever. I would have preferred a less vague answer, but I trusted her, so I nodded and held my hand out for her to take and lead the way. She gave me a wary look, and only after I nodded again she reached out and took my hand. I expected her to lead me into the woods, but that didn't happen. Instead, she walked around the house, to where a bunch of apple trees were planted in an open field. Some trees still blossomed while others already carried their first fruits, but these fruits were still green and small and needed a lot more time before we could harvest them. I checked in on them every now and then to make sure that there wasn't any problems with parasites or something, but otherwise I paid little attention to them. Angel pulled me towards one of the trees. "Do you want apples?" I asked, thoroughly confused by this point. I don't think they're ripe yet. I'm not a, what do you call it, herbivore. That had me laughing out loud. I think you mean vegan, I chuckled. She didn't laugh. Though to be honest, she rarely ever laughed or smiled, so I wasn't surprised by the lack of reaction. You need to see something, she said and pointed up to the tree's branches. Or more specifically, to a bunch of small apples that were not green, but pale white and almost translucent. What the fuck? I hesitantly reached out to grab one of the apples in an attempt to get a closer look, but as soon as my fingertips brushed against them, the transparent skin gave way and they nearly exploded, spilling a white liquid all over my hand. Ew. Shit, I cursed and pulled my hand back. The liquid didn't burn or anything, it felt cold against my skin and smelled sickly sweet like wilted flowers. Or rotten fruit. I shook my hand to get most of the fluid off and wiped the rest on my trousers. Granted, I wasn't a botanist, but I was pretty sure that this wasn't normal, so I turned to Angel and asked, "The hell is up with that?" "It's sick." She shrugged. "I thought you'd want to know." Yeah, I do. Thank you. Just. How did you even notice this?" I stuttered, gesturing at the infected tree. "It feels off." "Meaning that this isn't some ordinary tree disease?" She shook her head. "You should take care of this quickly. Before it spreads." "It spreads?" Oh, that was really the last thing I needed. Some weird inhuman disease that destroyed my produce. "Don't all diseases?" She raised an eyebrow and frowned. She had a point, and I was aware that I had to deal with this as soon as possible because there was no way of knowing what would happen otherwise. Hell, I didn't even know whether this sickness would affect animals and, in humans, for what it was worth this could be dangerous for anyone around. I didn't want to waste any time before collecting all the infected parts of the trees and burning them. There was no guarantee that this would work, but fire had proven itself to be a viable solution to a lot of past problems, so it was worth a try. And if it didn't work, I could still ask the grave lady for help. I thanked Angel sincerely and made sure she didn't need anything else before we parted ways, and I walked back towards the front of the house to check in on the teenagers before I'd take care of the infected trees. I didn't want to ask them for help though, since I wouldn't risk them getting sick. This was something I had to do by myself. Walking away, I noticed that the statue had appeared at the corner of my house, head turned towards me. "Hey, what's up?" I greeted her, but she stayed silent and unmoving as always. That thing really freaked me out. Every time I turned away from her, she would change her posture ever so slightly, just enough for me to notice, but she never moved while I looked at her. Well, as long as she didn't hurt anyone, I couldn't really complain. With one last look at her, I turned away and approached the teenagers. "Hey guys," I called out to the teenagers. "Do you want more lemonade or?" I stopped when I suddenly realized that there were only 3 of them sitting in the tree's shadow. I knew for a fact that there had been 4. Oh. Sam wasn't feeling so well, so she went to get more, the girl explained hesitantly. "Please don't be mad, okay? The heat made her dizzy and we didn't want to go get you because you were with that monster and..." Shit. I didn't let the girl finish, but turned around and ran towards my house instead. There were 3 rules for the teenagers to follow. Don't go into the woods, don't talk to the Inhumans, and don't enter my house under any circumstances. It was simple and usually that was enough to keep them safe and sound. And to be honest, I hadn't expected the 3rd rule to ever be broken, considering that there should be no reason ever for them to enter my house. You see, there are 7 Inhumans on my property. And one of them lived inside my house. I threw the unlocked door open to see the teenage girl walk over to the sink, presumably to get herself a glass of water. "Hey," I shouted. "The fuck are you doing in here?" The girl jumped and turned around. She looked at me with wide eyes. In her hands was an empty glass which she had gripped so tightly that I was worried it would shatter between her fingers. I crossed through the room quickly and grabbed the girl, her name was Sam, if I remembered correctly, by the arm. "You need to get out of here," I told her, already dragging her towards the entrance door, when a blood-curdling scream made us both jump. Shit. Too late. It materialized almost immediately. The banshee, as I had called it, seemed to be a ghost. The corpse of a man, half decayed and sickly thin, just distorted enough to be unsettling with its 2 long limbs and too thin head. It was translucent and hovered over the floor, the black hole that was its mouth was opened for a continuous angry scream. "What is that?" the girl, Sam, asked, a trembling hand pointing at the apparition. I didn't even get the chance to answer before the glass in Sam's hand burst and both of us screamed when shards rained down around us. For a moment we were frozen while the banshee continued its furious screeching and the furniture started to rattle and move. A falling plate, shattering on the floor, pulled me out of my stupor. I tightened my grip around Sam's wrist and pulled her towards the door. We stumbled onto the porch and I threw the door shut behind us, drowning out the banshee's screams at least a little. Both of us were breathing heavily, more from shock than exhaustion, and for a moment everything was silent except for faint screeching and breaking glass. "What was that?" Sam repeated her question from earlier as soon as she'd caught her breath. "The reason why you're not supposed to go in there," I hissed. This was a first for me, honestly. I'd never been anything but nice to the teenagers, but none of them had broken my rules so far. I was already on edge thanks to what Angel had told me, and an angry poltergeist was the last thing I needed. "Thanks, by the way. That thing's gonna wreck my house now." "Really? Is it so fucking hard to follow one simple rule?" "Hey, I'm sorry, okay?" She was still breathing a bit too fast. One of her hands clung to the railing to keep her steady. It was really hot hand. "I don't care," I interrupted her. "Do you have any idea what happens if one of you morons get hurt? You're my responsibility. And all I ask from you is to not wander off and get yourself killed like a fucking idiot, but apparently I overestimated you." I don't care, Sam." I cut her off harshly, arms crossed in front of my chest. Knowing the banshee, it would take several hours until it finally stopped screaming. The ghost always freaked out when somebody other than me entered the house. It had done the same thing to me back when I'd moved in, but now it had apparently accepted that I lived here and it wasn't going to get rid of me. I looked at the girl for a moment, thinking about what to do now. Behind closed doors I heard something shatter and I really hoped it hadn't been the expensive vase I had placed next to the TV. "You're fired," I told Sam coldly. "What? You can't be serious." "Hell, I need this job," she protested. Her fingers tightened around the railing, her pallid face finally regained some color. "Well, you should have thought about this earlier. It wasn't like I didn't care. I did. Really. But I had made a decision and I would stick to it. Go home, Sam. I have a mess to take care of." With that, I turned around and entered the house again, feeling sick to my stomach and very, very tired. I spent the rest of the day behind my house, getting rid of the infected parts of my trees. After carefully cutting the branches that carried the pale apples off the tree, I threw them onto a small pile and burnt them, hoping it would eradicate whatever disease they had been affected with. All of that was done under the watchful eyes of the statue, which stayed close to me the entire afternoon. The statue's behavior was new and that made it even more unsettling. Sure, the rusted figure tended to move around, but it was rarely as restless as it was that day and it certainly never stayed so close to me for so long. It usually picked a place somewhere around the house and stayed there for the entire day. Now, however, it moved every time I turned my back. I was reluctant to look away after a while, considering that it came a little closer every time it moved, but I convinced myself somehow that it was fine. The statue was scary, but it wasn't aggressive, not like the gutless or the bloated. Everything was alright. The statue had always been the one that gave me the least trouble. Even the sane ones, like Karth, got on my nerves every now and then, not exactly by going on a rampage, but they sometimes showed up at my house and asked something from me. And the one that was technically the easiest to avoid, the banshee, was annoying as hell since it kept me from inviting anyone over. Not that I had friends anyways. But it was still annoying. The statue, on the other hand, had always seemed content with just existing on this property. Until today. Today, when I was done with the trees, just when the sun was about to set and when the teenagers had already gone home, I turned around and found myself face to face with the statue, which had its helmet removed. It could have been a beautiful face, actually. That of a young woman, carefully sculpted in all its details, twisted into a grimace of pure anger. Her open mouth bared sharp teeth and she made a screeching sound as I saw her move for the very first time. In a clunky, sudden motion, she jerked her hand upwards and I had just enough time to make a quick step to the side before her sword shot forward. I was so fucked. My fight or flight reflex kicked in immediately and I turned around and ran, screaming for help that I knew wouldn't come. The statue blocked the direct path to the door of my house, so I had to run the other way around to get in. Would I even manage to open the door before the statue caught up with me? Should I run into the woods instead, hoping to come across Angel or Karth? Or to the graveyard, betting on the grave lady's help? The statue's movement was surprisingly silent. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, my lungs stung already, the adrenaline was all that kept me on my feet. The ground was uneven and had me stumble several times, which only made me panic more. I was dead, I thought, I would end up impaled by the sword of the statue without even knowing why it had suddenly snapped. I went around the corner, ready to run onto my front porch and finally enter my house to get some physical barrier between me and the mad statue. However, as soon as I was in front of the house, I saw the statue running towards me. Apparently it had gone the other way around the house. I tried to stop, to turn around, to walk backwards, to do anything to get away from the monster, but ended up falling to the ground instead. The sudden impact knocked the air out of my lungs and for a moment I just lay there, trying to catch my breath. The statue was over me before I got the chance to even try to stand up again. Her sword was pointed at my stomach, the face still distorted in anger, and I didn't try to fight anymore, now that the situation was hopeless. And then the statue stopped dead in her movement as suddenly, with a crushing sound, a claw pierced through its chest, and as soon as it was removed again, the metal figure fell to the ground. I looked up to Angel and thought how fitting her name was, because right now as the dying sunlight cast shadows over her face and her claw was still outstretched, she did look like an angel of vengeance. "Finish her," she commanded coldly, her head turned towards her companion. "Since you asked so nicely." Karth smirked as he grabbed her wrist and dragged one of her sharp claws over his lower arm. Black blood flowed from the rather deep cut and he let the liquid fall onto the statue, which made another screeching sound before the metal melted as if pure acid was poured onto it. All that was left of the statue, in the end, was her sword, one hand and her helmet. "I told you she was acting up," Angel said to Karth, still in the same cold tone as before. He merely shrugged. "Guess you were right. Well, even a blind." He looked at her face and corrected himself, "A one-eyed chicken finds a corn sometimes." Angel glared at him. I rolled my eyes at the rather ridiculous exchange and hurried to get back on my feet. The movement must have been too fast though, because as soon as I was back up my vision went black and I felt myself falling again. Before I hit the ground, an arm wrapped around my waist and a hand grabbed my shoulder to steady me, and a second later, when my vision cleared again, I realized that it was Karth who had caught me. "Careful there, princess," he said in that goddamn teasing tone he always used when he talked to me. I usually would have talked back somehow, but in this moment I didn't even attempt to free myself from him. I was still unsteady and didn't trust my legs to carry me, so I kept both hands on Karth's shoulders, just to be sure. "Thank you," I said. "Both of you. You guys saved my life and..." "Yeah, thank you." "You're welcome, Alice," Angel replied. "We can't have you dying so fast, right?" Karth added before his expression changed to something unusually serious. "She didn't hurt you, did she?" I quickly shook my head. "No, I'm fine, just a little shaken, I guess." If that wasn't the understatement of the century. "You came just in time. This is good to hear," Angel said, and I turned my head to see her pick up the statue's rusty sword. She looked at the weapon for a moment before holding it out for me to grab. "Here. You should keep this." I didn't want to keep the weapon that had almost killed me just a few minutes ago, but I knew I couldn't refuse. Even a fool would realize that a sword belonging to a supernatural entity had to be powerful. And after the ordeal with the Gutless a few days ago, I definitely knew better than to refuse a weapon that one of my Inhumans handed me. Thanks?" I hesitantly let go off Karth to grab the sword's hilt. The rust felt rough against my skin and the blade was surprisingly heavy, making me almost drop it as soon as Angel let go. "You guys know that I have no idea how to handle that thing, yes?" I asked. "It's not that hard, princess," Karth shrugged, his grin back on his lips. "The pointy end goes into the enemy." And I was exhausted, tired, shaken from my near-death experience and probably still high on adrenaline, and one of these things was probably the reason why this seriously bad joke had me laughing out loud. I thanked the two Inhumans again and finally went home, where I discarded the rusty sword on the living room table and went straight into the kitchen to prepare some food for my husband and me. The banshee had wrecked the room, but I decided that this was a problem for tomorrow since I didn't have the nerves to deal with this today. All I wanted to do is lie down and get some rest, hopefully not thinking anymore about all the shit that had happened, although I was sure the statue would follow me into my nightmares. However, I had to admit, Angel had proven herself to be a good friend once more. And maybe, just maybe, Karth wasn't that bad either. Not that I would ever tell him that.